Back in 2010, Joe McGill was working at Magnolia Plantation in Charleston, South Carolina, as a history consultant. And one day he got to wondering what it would be like to spend a night in one of the slave cabins, which you're seeing right now on your screen, on that property. So he mentioned it to the director of the site, and the director said, go right ahead. And that was the start of the slave dwelling project. 11 years later, Joe has slept in more than 200 slave dwellings in 25 states, north and south, plus the District of Columbia. Michigan today makes number 26. Go, Joe. He has slept in slave dwellings at 5 different presidential sites, including Mount Vernon and Monticello. He's given talks and presentations around the country and has facilitated fireside conversations about slavery's legacy and about race and racism with thousands of people from all walks of life and backgrounds. He's also invited many of those people to join him on his sleepovers. I've done 4 of them myself, and I can tell you that even though it is way out of my comfort zone, I heartily recommend the experience to you. As director of the Slave Dwelling Project, Joe has also hosted 5 national conferences, and he's working on a 6th, which will take place this coming fall, virtually. Joe and his work have been featured in the Smithsonian Magazine, the New York Times, House Beautiful, and quite remarkably to me, on Fox News. Said Joe's the only one who gets me to watch that. Joe McGill is one of the key reasons that historic sites across the United States are changing the way they interpret American history, and that's a change for the good. He's got lots more credentials. He's worked at the National Trust. He was director of the African American Museum in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He's been a national park ranger at Fort Sumter, but I don't want to take too much more time from his presentation. I just want to add that Joe's initial inspiration for the Slave Dwelling Project was the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam. In the same way that that site marks a place of unimaginable human suffering and endurance, Joe wanted to honor this country's African-American ancestors by drawing attention to the sites, quote unquote, behind the big house, where for more than 200 years, enslaved people lived and worked and built not only this country, but an extraordinary legacy. Please join me in welcoming Joe to Michigan, where there is no snow here today, Joe, and the daffodils are blooming in your honor. Thanks.
Wow. Thank you, Leslie, for the introduction. Yes, my name is Joseph McGill, and let me see if I can flip the camera without hanging up on you. Just to let you guys see my mug, know that I am here talking to you live. We're at the Magnolia Plantation and Gardens in Charleston, South Carolina. So with that, let me flip this camera back if I can. Okay, so what you see there in front of you are restored slave cabins at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens in Charleston, South Carolina. The history of Magnolia Plantation and Gardens is similar to the history of pretty much all plantations in the state of South Carolina. The Draytons, D-R-A-Y-T-O-N, D-R-A-Y-T-O-N, came over here from Barbados in 1670 with a larger contingency of English men and women. And guys, there's a plane flying by right now, so I'm gonna pause just a little, just to let that plane fly by and do its thing, because it's going to be a little challenging for you to hear me with the plane flying by. So yes, in 1670, the Draytons came over here with a larger contingency of English men and women from the island of Barbados. In King Charles' experiment, a business venture that he was carrying on in this period of colonization, the intent was to colonize as many places in the New World as possible, and exploit the land and send everything that they can take away from the land back to England. They did that in Barbados. They exhausted the ability to continue to grow the sugarcane that they were growing in Barbados, so it was time for them to move on. And that time that they moved on was 1670. Landed here in the Charleston, South Carolina area at a place called Albemarle Point. Albemarle, that's Albermarle, Albemarle Point. Today it's a state park. It's called Charlestown Landing. Now, when they landed there, they knew almost immediately that that was not the best place to occupy, because in order to occupy that land, they had to purge the natives. Now, when they're there, of course, they're experimenting with everything. They're putting everything in the ground that they think will grow. And at the time that they're experimenting agriculturally, they're also purging natives. Because the Draytons did not occupy this property until 1676. Again, they had to wait for the natives to be purged. So the Draytons, like others who were settled there at Albemarle Point, started to acquire land once that was done. The Draytons acquired this land in 1676, 2,000 acres of swamp. And they had to start preparing the swamp to grow something. But it was the enslaved people who was doing the work of preparing this swamp to grow something. They were cutting down the cypress trees in this cypress swamp, but they got it done. And after they got it done, the Draytons started to experiment here on what would grow here. A lot of things failed. The first thing they tried to grow here, of course, was sugarcane, because of course that's what they were growing in Barbados. That failed. They tried citrus fruit. That failed. They tried to produce silk. All that failed. Now, what worked initially was raising cattle. In fact, the first cowboys in this nation were enslaved people. But it was those enslaved people here on this property who figured out what would grow here because of where they were taken from in Africa. And it was the west coast of Africa. It had a similar topography to here, and I was hoping that I was going to be able to show you a little more of the topography here, but we tested that before we went live with you guys, and we thought that it was wiser just stay here and maintain the link that we have with you. But the topography between where they were taken from in Africa and this topography was similar. So the enslaved people are now inserted here. Now, while the planters are experimenting, putting everything in the ground and failing, the enslaved people are growing these plots of rice for themselves, for their personal use. Of course, what once some of these enslavers are going to click, well, rice will grow here because the enslaved people are growing it here on these properties that we have now acquired. Well, it takes the entrepreneurial mind to figure out, well, you can enterprise this thing. You can make money from selling rice and growing and selling rice. And they did. And at some point in the history of the planters here in South Carolina, they became some of the richest men of that period in the United States. If you were to make a listing of the richest men of that period, the richest planters of that period, the top 10, 7 of those men would have been rice planters. And a lot of those men were concentrated right here in the state of South Carolina. And of course, that eventually would contribute to the fact that, South Carolina was the first to secede from the Union. So a lot of that was born right here. A lot of that thought process to secede from the Union was born right here on this property. But, back to the Draytons. The Draytons have now acquired this property, and they're experimenting. They're cutting down the trees. And all the time that they're experimenting, they're also raising cattle. And because they're raising cattle, they're sustaining themselves. And because they're cutting down those cypress trees, that's another market. Of course, one market is Barbados, where they came from. They had already, made that place so inhabitable, or took away the good resources, the trees and all, that was a market to send the trees that they're now cutting down on this property back to the island of Barbados. Again, another market. So the Draytons would continue to own this property up to the Civil War. In fact, the ownership of this property here has gone uninterrupted. You know, even through two major wars that saw activities right here on this property, the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, the Draytons still managed to maintain possession of this property. During the Revolutionary War, a contingency of British soldiers came here and set up camp. During the Civil War, a contingency of Sherman's men came through and burned the big house here. They didn't touch the slave cabins that were here at the time. And these were the slave cabins that were here at the time, because these slave cabins that you see here in front of you were built here in 1850. They replaced slave cabins that were here before. The slave cabins that were here before, we have archaeological evidence that they had dirt floors. We don't know very much more than that about the slave cabins that these replaced. These cabins that you see here before you were duplexes when they were initially built. Duplexes meaning that there were two families per building. Two families per building. Now, the common question that I get, or we get here, is, you know, how many enslaved people per family? Well, the best answer that we could give is the number that the enslaved woman can biologically give birth to minus the number of enslaved people that the enslaver had to sell. Because at the end of the year, if the ends don't meet, you got to sell property. The people living in these cabins would be that property. Now, prior to 1808, when it was legal to import, still legal to import people into this nation, because 20 years prior to 1808, 1787, we're in our nation's capital, which was then Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We are considering the ratification of our Constitution at our Constitutional Convention. And in 1787, Southerners demanded 20 more years to continue to import people into this nation for the purpose of enslaving them, because their economy depended on it. And they got their 20 years. So 1808, that 20 years is up. So up until 1808, the lifespan of an enslaved person was very short, because you worked them under the gang style of work. You worked them from sunup to sundown, work them to death, just imported more. After 1808, it becomes illegal to import people into this nation. Now the life expectancy of enslaved Africans are now increased. You find them now dying more of old age after 1808. Another common question is, well, what was the lifespan prior to 1808? Well, if you were one of the 12 million who made it across the Atlantic Ocean alive, didn't find your grave at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, then chances were you were being shipped to South America. The majority of people taken out of Africa were shipped to South America for various reasons. One, it was a shorter route. You know, you could get from Africa to South America in about a month. Whereas if you were on a slave ship coming from Africa to the United States, it would take anywhere from, you know, a month and a half to 2 months. Imagine all that time on a slave ship in those conditions. But back to the lifespan of enslaved people prior to 1808. If you were inserted into a mine, if you were taking things out of the earth, mining, your life expectancy was 3 years. If you were put on a sugarcane plantation, your life expectancy was 7 years. If you were working on a rice plantation like this, your life expectancy was about 7 years. Now, after 1808, when you can't legally import them anymore, you are now dealing with people dying of old age, more people dying of old age. If we would have gone back to the cemetery, as I wanted to go back to the cemetery, I would have shown you some headstones of some formerly enslaved people. Now, those formerly enslaved people were born enslaved and died free. Therefore, they have headstones. There are a lot of graves back there that are unmarked, because making a headstone, putting a headstone on a grave, denotes that you're educated because you put stuff on there that you have to read. And we know that educating enslaved people was illegal. So that was the case here. Now, after 1808, again, you can't import them anymore. We got people now dying of old age. Now, the Draytons continue to own this property, up to the Civil War, through the Civil War, and beyond. Now, during the Civil War is when the rice growing went away because the free labor went away. Now, generally, the planting of rice went away here in South Carolina for three main reasons. During the Civil War, the free labor went away. That's the main reason. The second reason is because, we're in Charleston, South Carolina. All along the coast of South Carolina, the rice planting depended on the tides, the high and low tides of the ocean. So there's brackish water, there's salt water mixed in with the fresh water. And in growing rice, you can never let salt water enter into your rice fields because that would kill the crops. And imagine that happening and the crop dies and your owner has to file for bankruptcy and that your owner has to sell property. That property could be you. So that speaks to the knowledge of enslaved people that they brought over here with them in growing rice. So they had to engineer this swamp to grow rice, and that they did. All right, so now, after the Civil War ends, the people are now free. So they have a choice to make here on this property. They could, they could go into this world and try to prosper in this world. Well, that happened as long as the United States Army was in the area after the Civil War. That's the time of Reconstruction. Now, from 1865 to 1877, Reconstruction, there was hope for the formerly enslaved people, including the enslaved people that were occupying these cabins, because now the enslaved people have a choice. They could stay or they could go. Well, some chose to stay. The ones who chose to stay here on this property are now paid employees, paid to work on the grounds, paid to work here on this property. Now, people would live in these cabins that you see here up until 1990. And, I get folks who say, well, man, they lived in these places up until the 1990s. And then I have to point out to the audience that, there are places still in the United States today where these houses would be an upgrade. And it comes to, and it kind of, brings it, make it more realistic for them. I also have to remind them of the fact that we got to think about those things that replace slavery, because once that United States Army was taken out of the South, in 1876, when Rutherford B. Hayes was elected. Now, Rutherford B. Hayes is governor of Ohio. He is, during the Civil War, a Union Army officer. Prior to the Civil War, he's an abolitionist. So he is everything that the South is against, at least those Southerners with power who wanted power. He was everything that they were against. So the Southern Compromise is this. Now, they compromise because Rutherford B. Hayes wins the Electoral College, not the popular vote. So the Southern Compromise is this. If you want a smooth transition, pull the United States Army out of the South, we'll take it from here. Well, taking it from here is convict labor, KKK, lynchings, redlining, poll taxes, Jim Crow laws, black codes. That's the South's version of taking it from here. Okay, so back to these cabins that you see in front of you. The one there that's in the screen right now, if you can see that, I'm hoping that you can. That one is restored to look like the year 1850. 1850 is the year all these cabins were built. In 1850, they were all duplexes, 2 families per building. The one there that's in your screen right now, if you can see me pointing there, that one is restored to look like the year 1930. 1930. Now I was hoping that you could walk through these cabins with me and I can show you the inside. But again, I don't want to lose this feed that we've got. That one is restored to look like the year 1930. Again, people are still living here after 1865, but now they're paid employees. Now they're getting paid, and they have to pay the rent. Now they have to pay rent to live in these cabins after the Civil War. But after the Civil War, it's one family per building, one family per building. And again, these are single family units in the 1930s. And then there's the one right there in the screen right now. That was restored to look like the year 1969. 1969, that's the year Mr. Johnny Leash moved out of that cabin. Mr. Johnny Leash was a head gardener. He lived there for 20 years and he raised 13 children in that space. In fact, two of his children are still working here on the plantation, Now, here, their ancestors were enslaved at Middleton Plantation. Middleton Plantation is the plantation west of here that is also open to the public. Now, I'm impressed by Middleton Plantation because every 3 years or so, they do these family reunions. And they bring together the descendants of those who were enslaved at that plantation and the descendants of those who enslaved them. And that impresses me because we don't do that here. We're working on that. Now, the fourth cabin that people can go into is restored to look like the year 1870. 1870 is that period that I talked about some already, that Reconstruction period where there was hope for the recently freed and enslaved people until they pulled the United States Army out of the South. So again, this was a tourist attraction since 1870. So since 1870, there are people coming here to tour this place. And up until 2009, the story of the enslaved people was not a part of what they offered here. It took, this is a family-owned business, always been a family-owned business. Because this was a family-owned business, up until 2009, the story that they were telling didn't include these slave cabins. Nowhere in the narrative was these slave cabins. It was the younger generation of Draytons that felt it necessary that we needed to do right by these cabins. And that's one of the reasons I'm working here. When I used to work for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, my hours got reduced. And to compensate for that, I started working here at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. Eventually, that job at the National Trust just went away. It totally reduced to zero. And then my time here increased. And for at least the last year or so, I've been working here full time, in addition to going around the nation and finding these slave dwellings to sleep in. So I get to come here, 5 days a week, and I get to talk to people. I get to talk to folks about these slave dwellings. Now, the amazing thing about talking to folks now is that, living this COVID world that we're living in, we had to close down for 1 month. About a year ago, this time we were closed, but it was only for about 1 month. And when we came back, prior to us going on this 1 month vacation that we wanted, hey guys, if I push too much up against this 20 minutes that I know I have, let me know, because I'll just go on and on and on. I don't want to do that. So prior to us closing down for COVID, this tour that we give about these cabins, this tour was chosen the least, because most people who come to plantations, well, not most, a good number of people who come to plantations don't come for what you see here in front of you. A lot of people who come to plantations, they come to see that history that's been disseminated to them, and a lot of times that's a revisionist history. It's sugar coated. It's watered down. The hoop skirt, mint julep, gone with the wind version of history is what a lot of people come to plantations for, and that's still the case. And there's still plantations out there that will give them that. But since we've come back, this tour is highly competitive, and I attribute that to two things. there is, of course, the crowd has gotten younger because of COVID. The crowd has gotten more diverse, in my opinion, because of George Floyd. Because when I open up my audience to questions and answers, a lot of the questions are about reparations. Well, what are the Draytons doing about reparations? What are they doing to compensate for those people who lived in these places? Are there mulattoes in the inventory of the Draytons? You know, people who had white parent, well, one white parent. You know, they're asking these kinds of questions, and then I get all these. This other number one question that I get, of course, is were the Draytons good slave owners? Of course, I have to be nice and answer them as if I'm hearing the question for the first time. I can't be condescending when I answer them. But you know, I have to explain to them in a manner that, you know, the Draytons, we know that that 3 people escaped because we have evidence of the advertising for them to get it back. Now we have to safely assume, common sense would have to tell us that more than 3 escaped, but we just have evidence of the 3. And I also tell them that the Draytons freed no one, none, 0. They also lived the lavish lives that they lived because of the people who inhabited these cabins, whose labor that they stole. And the last enslaver here was an Episcopal priest. So then I could put a period right there and kind of let them figure it out from there. Now, what I also found out is when they'll start that question, then they'll look me straight in the eyes, and then they'll start struggling with the questions because now they realize that they're talking to a descendant of someone who was enslaved, and they're not going to get that answer that they're going to get. But I answered it in the manner that I do. So I get the pleasure of hanging out here and telling people about these places, and having a good time doing it. And in addition to that, you know, every now and again, at least once a month now, I get to go somewhere and other places like this and do what I do there. Next month, I'll be going to Natchez, Mississippi. For any of you who might be familiar with Natchez, Mississippi, they do this thing every year called the Pilgrimage. Well, they invite people to come, and they make money off that Gone with the Wind version of history, and they make a lot of money off that Gone with the Wind version of history. Well, what I'm going to be doing there next month is it counters that. So I said that to say this: I'll be going to Natchez, Mississippi next month, guys. So yes.
It's Leslie. I'm going to pop in for a sec. We're wondering if there's any chance, because you had pretty decent bandwidth. Is there any chance you could go around the back as you were before and show us that view? Do you want to risk it?
Yeah, I can even try to go into one of the cabins if you want me to.
Be fantastic if you think you've got light. And then maybe I'm one of the things I've discovered talking to students is not all students are familiar with Gone with the Wind. Which is maybe not a bad thing, but I'm wondering if maybe you could just elaborate a little on sort of what that image is versus what you tell people.
Yeah, the Gone with the Wind version of history is the happy slave and the benevolent slave owner. The folks are hoping that that's what happened here. They want to hear that, again, the Draytons treated people nicely and kindly. But again, that's not what happened yet. I'm about to step into this cabin, guys. I hope you can see this. I'm moving slowly. You still got to feed?
Yeah.
I'm going to open this window here so we can get a little light in here. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, beautiful. Good.
So Joe.
Okay, so I'm in one of the cabins. Yes.
I always, because I live in the north, like there's one window and one door, and how hot does it get there in the summer? And how many people were living in this room?
Oh yeah, it gets hot. I mean, you're not, anywhere from 90 plus, and then you throw in some bugs. You're competing with all that. Now, this is the space. I've got my back on the wall here, guys. So you see a wall right there. Now that's half the size of this building, but this half is for one family. A lot of times I get kids in this space, and then I ask the kids how many of them have a bedroom larger than this. About half of them will raise their hands. And then I could be realistic with them, because that's when I tell them that, these spaces are designed for one family. And again, one family is the number of people, children that enslaved woman could produce versus the number of people that enslaver would sell. Now, after 1808, when we can't import them anymore, the chances of becoming a multi-generational family on a plantation is now increased. So sometimes you have multi-generational family living in these spaces. You don't see any furnishings in here because they didn't have any furnishings in there back then. They slept on pallets. That straw hair moss stuffed in some material, looks like a big old pillowcase laid out on the floor. That's where they slept. So that is this space. Did I answer the questions, Leslie, or did I miss something?
You did. You didn't talk about winter, what that's like, because I'm looking at those drafty floorboards. And I'm also kind of wondering about your first experience, that first time you spent the night here. What did you discover? What have you discovered by sleeping in these places?
Oh, oh yeah, yeah. The first time I spent the night not in this cabin, but the fourth one down. They had a fire in the fireplace, although it wasn't necessary. It was May, but I spent the night. They had the fire in the fireplace. There's a bed in there, and I don't know why I foolishly thought that I could sleep in that bed because it was pine straw in it, and I didn't know what was living in there. But I got in it and I tried, but I quickly gave up on that. And then I spread my sleeping bag on the floor, and I quickly discovered that I should have brought a padding, a sleeping bag, and a pillow. And I didn't make that mistake anymore. And from that point forward, I was taking a padding, a sleeping bag, and a pillow. And I used to carry a club with me because I thought that if I was sleeping in one of these places and some animal tried to invade my space, at least I could try to hit it with the club. Or maybe even if a human was trying to invade my space, I could deal with that too. A lot of people were nervous for me because they thought, there were people out there that would want to bring me harm. The Confederate flag 11 years ago was still pretty prominent here in the state of South Carolina, still flying on the State House grounds. It did so until the Dillon Roof occasion, but I don't want to go into details of that. But yeah, those were there were things going through my mind about people occupying this space, women giving birth and the children belonging to the enslavers and not them, their work not benefiting them, their labor being stolen. So those are the kinds of things that you think about, and it was very hard to get to sleep when I was in that spot the first night because there was a limb being blown and interacting with the roof, and didn't know what that was. It took me 5 times getting up to prove to myself, convince myself that it was that limb that I was that I was hearing. So those are the things. But you see the floor there, guys. The gaps there. If you look at that wall, you see that there's not a whole lot of privacy there. So whatever goes on this side here, you could hear and see going on this side from the other side, and vice versa. A lot of the things that we do in our houses today, they did outside of these spaces.
Joe, we have a first question, which says, thank you for this tour. Are the current Draytons open to the idea of reparations for the descendants of slaves from this plantation?
Yeah, another very common question since we've come back after COVID, and the answer is no. They have not entertained that. Now, here's what they do. They have a philanthropic arm of the family business that they do give money from. It's not outrageous amounts. The largest amounts that they've given any organization is $10,000, and in lore. And they also, during the time that family that moved out of that one cabin in 1969, the gentleman who raised the 13 children in that space, they either went to college or the military. All those kids that went to college, their tuitions were paid by the Draytons. And of course, they have this. At one point in the history of the Draytons, they had to make the decision as to whether these cabins were going to still exist or were they going to go away. Well, the decision of the younger Draytons was to allow them to exist. And by my definition, that's a form of reparations. Now, that question is often put to me from the audiences that we bring out here for this tour. Well, one thing more recently, I've been not only kind of put it back on them. Most of the audiences that are there are white folks. And, I tell them that I don't know the demographics. Well, I don't know the ancestry of the people sitting in front of me. And I don't know if any of them are descendants of slave owners. But if they are they as liable as the Draytons for paying reparations? Because, they could see this physical aspect of slavery here on this property, but I don't think they ever think about their ancestry and who in their past or in their family enslaved people. You got another plane flying by.
Joe, we have a related question, which is, what do you think about reparations? A small question.
Okay, I hear it. We got a plane flying by. So what I think about reparations, I think it should be paid forward. In other words, I don't think, I'm not looking for a check in my time. I think there should be some type of endowment established. You take, you take places, you take the Draytons. Again, you could follow the money easily. But you take a company like Brooks Brothers that is going through bankruptcy right now, and somebody's going to throw a lot of money at them to keep them solvent and above, from going under. Well, I think a part of that is to establish some type of fund, some type of endowment that's going to benefit people in the future. So it's kind of like what Georgetown University. When Georgetown University almost went under, what they did, they sold people to Louisiana. Well, the descendants of those people can now go to Georgetown University at a lower rate. But above and beyond that, the students there voted that, above, let's charge a little extra on my tuition and throw it into this pot, into this endowment to pay it forward. Now, another thing about reparations is this. Are you going to tie it just to slavery? Are you going to go beyond that and deal with the disenfranchisement that happened after slavery? Those things that continue to keep, free Blacks of that period and beyond up until present from accumulating wealth. Those things like convict labor and poll taxes and redlining and KKK and Jim Crow laws and Black codes. Or, are you going to, make it compensate for all that? Another thing about reparations is this. You have to factor in Africans selling Africans, because there was that. How liable are they in this equation of reparations? And somebody's going to have to do a lot of math, to figure out who's owed what. And somebody's going to have to do a lot of genealogical work, depending on what you're trying to tie this reparations to. You take the city of Chicago, there's a city on the outskirts of Chicago somewhere, Evanston, I think, that just passed a law, resolution to pay reparations, or maybe considering it. But they're tying it to more recent disenfranchisement and not slavery. So I hope there's an answer in there somewhere for you.
Thank you. It's a complicated question,
yes,
but it's an important one. Another question: what happened to the mixed race children on this plantation and to their descendants?
Yeah, they were enslaved, just like people of pure African descent, or just Black folks. They were in the categories of being enslaved. Enslaved people was what their mothers were. Now, one misconception that we have, they think that the mulattoes had it easier. Not necessarily. because if you're the mistress of the plantation, that's evidence of infidelity, and you're not going to want that. You're not going to want to be reminded of that. So they really had a hard time. Now, most of the free blacks of that period were indeed mulattoes. So that means that they were taken out of that environment of being enslaved. That environment they did. Now, if you're the midwife, which were usually enslaved people, giving birth to this child to come into this world, and if you see what you're faced with, if you got the power to take action to remove that child from that environment, the wise thing to do is to remove that child from that environment. Get them to another plantation, or get it to someone that is going to allow that child to live. Because again, if you got people making the decisions just based on the fact that this child is a mulatto, a child that you don't want it known that infidelity exists, then the fate of that child could be deadly, and that's not good either.
Joe, you use the word plantation, and I know that that's a controversial word. Some people, Edward Baptist in his History of Slavery calls them slave labor camps. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that and maybe touch on the whole plantation wedding question as well.
Oh yeah. Plantation. I think the word plantation, as it applies to this very property that I'm on and in places like it, I think that they should leave plantation in its name. Because, if you ask a person if they visited a plantation, they may say no. But if you ask that same person if they visited Monticello or Montpelier or the Hermitage or Mount Vernon, they may say no. Well, those are plantations. They're just plantations that were owned by our former presidents. 12 of our former presidents were slave owners. Well, somebody in the past, in bringing these places online and getting them ready for visitors, they made this decision that, well, we don't want that in this name because this was one of our presidents. Why should we associate them with that? Well, that's part of the problem that we're facing now, trying to hide that element of our history, and now people are kind of toying with that word, and trying to just get rid of it all. Now, there's this thing that people have this thing that they want to do. They want to put the plantation moniker on everything. Plantation shutters or something plantation. Has nothing to do with being a plantation, not even on a property that was a plantation. They just think it's a good word to throw around. And in those cases, if they name something in that manner, I think they should take that name off of places like that. Well, if I could have gone for my walk the way I wanted to go, not very far from where I'm standing right now, there's a wedding going on as we speak. Weddings on plantation that's quite controversial. Well, not necessarily controversial to the ones who actually have weddings on plantations. And when I say that, I need to say this. I know Black folks who've gotten married on plantations, but generally the people who get married on plantations are white. And for a good percentage of African Americans, we've got a problem with that. Because we see this kind of as being a sacred place, and a wedding being done on a plantation is for us is kind of disrespectful. So that has been an issue. It's more of an issue more recently because people are paying more attention to the fact that these things are indeed happening on plantations. Now, one thing that I remind people of is that, if we are, as African Americans, are upset about weddings on plantations, imagine how Native Americans should feel, I should say, because in most cases where these plantations exist, once upon a time there was a Native American presence. And in this colonization and in this purging of this nation and in this acquiring these places where these plantations were, we were engaging in some cases genocide, in some cases trying to enslave Native Americans, which didn't work here, but capturing them and taking them to the Caribbean islands did work. But the weddings on plantations will always be an issue. It's not going away.
And they're big money makers, I'm sure, for the
Oh
revenue
yes.
sources. Yeah.
Mhm.
Some things don't change, right?
Good. That's
A
great.
question for you, Joe. Do you notice a big difference in comfort / interest among Black Americans being interested in going to these sites versus whites or other racial groups in the United States?
Yeah, I noticed a big difference. Visiting a plantation is not on our short list of places to visit, because of the historical trauma involved. Um, going back to what you said, which I didn't address. A lot of folks want to call these places enforced work camps. I don't want to go there. Because it to me is kind of too close to concentration camp, and I don't want to. Although the Holocaust and slavery have some things that run parallel, I don't want to try to confuse those two issues. I want to try to keep them as separate as possible, because they both deserve the respect that they need. And to try to conflate the two, I don't think is a good thing. And again, that's why I want to stick with with the plantation. But as far as the desire of African Americans to visit such places like this is again, it's not on our short list, and we're trying to change that. And of course, Leslie, you're part of this battle as a board member. We're trying to let folks know what incentive do the properties have to change the narrative.
Joe, you went out a little bit on that one. You want to repeat just that last thought, please?
Yeah. So, visiting these sites are not on our short list of things to do, but I try to convince African Americans that if we're not in the audience, what incentive does the property owners have to change the narratives?
Thank you. Could you talk just a little bit about, you've talked about bringing together descendants of enslaved and descendants of enslavers. Could you say a little bit about, I mean, that's kind of a phenomenon nowadays. And, I would imagine many people would think that could be very uncomfortable. Could you talk a little bit about what happens when when those two groups come together?
Yeah, well, it is uncomfortable, and I'm okay with that, because part of the problem is that we've been living in our comfort zones for so long, that it allows us to continue to ignore those parts of history that we should have been dealing with all along, the parts of history that should have been there in the narrative, but it's still not there. But as far as that applies to the slave dwelling project, we have a beautiful time bringing people together on these properties and sleeping here. Now, the sleeping is the easy part. The hard part is the uncomfortable part, is the conversations that we have, usually around a campfire, about slavery and the legacy that is left on this nation. And in these conversations, we throw everything into the pot. We talk about the weddings on plantations. We talk about the Confederate monuments. Should they go or should they stay? We talk about historical trauma. We talk about white supremacy. We talk about white privilege. We throw everything into the pot. Now, because of the more recent occurrence of George Floyd's death, now we even throw that into the conversation, and we deal with those things. Yeah, there's some discomfort, but we do it. We do what we must.
I'll just say a little plug for anybody and if anybody on this call is interested in knowing more about the project, please feel free to send me an email. But it's the breakfast conversations that I find almost the most meaningful, because there's something about spending the night in a strange place with people you don't know, and then waking up the next morning. Joe, I've got two more questions for you, if you're good with that.
Yes.
One of them is, in your view, let me see, I want to make sure I'm getting right. Yeah, in your view, do the visits of people to this plantation, I assume they mean Magnolia, help resolve historical trauma associated with slavery?
It does. It does, in my opinion, yes. Now, I had an example today. As I address my audience, I could see the ones that aren't taking it too well, and they're usually white males, um, and they seem to resist the message more so than any category of people. But the message is always the same. I just heard a story here. Um, I just heard a story here from one of my colleagues who does what I do. He's white, and he just got reamed by an African American about the Draytons still making money off of slavery, and it hit him real hard because he's been working here almost as long as working here, and giving that tour for quite some time. But I think because of now George Floyd and all that has brought to the fore, the fact that these properties like this should be more accountable. If they don't want to go as far as the reparations thing, at least go as far as giving us the correct narrative. Don't continue to lie to us and make our history a fairy tale. Be real about the history. And I think I lost the premise of that question. Did I answer it?
I think that's a really important, just that idea of don't make our history a fairy tale.
Yeah.
There's another T-shirt slogan for the Slave Dwelling Project, right?
Oh, wow.
Let me ask you one. We have one final question, and that is, if you're willing to share, what have been the personal impacts or benefits that you've experienced by spending so much time on these sites?
Well, what I've discovered is, it's not a bad thing to talk to people who don't look like you, because we spend so much time talking to people who look like us, and we think we're okay in that comfort zone, and we are. We are fine in that comfort zone, but we got to get beyond. We got to get out of that comfort zone and talk to people who don't look like us. When I met you, Leslie, I was impressed by the fact that you were doing this research on your family, and you were taking it from the angle of you weren't hiding anything. You weren't doing this research to find out things that that you wanted to keep secret. You found out some things about your family that if you were to reveal these things, it can make you an outcast amongst some already established friends and maybe even some family members. But you didn't turn away from it. And I'm discovering there are a lot of people like that out there. A lot of people are attracted to the project, to places that are going that extra effort, that putting forth that extra effort to tell the real story. And that's one of the reasons why this tour here at Magnolia has gotten more popular. More popular because of fact, COVID factored into that. The crowd has gotten younger, but it's gotten more diverse because of of George Floyd and all that happened to him. There are more people out there wanting to know our real history. And so for me personally, I found out that I've gotten a little bolder in my ways in talking about this subject matter, and I've gotten more comfortable in talking about this subject matter. Just as I'm talking to you guys right now and expressing what I do, going around sleeping at these places, we get more and more invitations like this. I talked to you about, going to Natchez, Mississippi next month. The next month after that, we're going to Texas. We go to those northern states. It has this thing has educated me far beyond, from where I started, 11 years ago. 11 years ago, I had slavery relegated to plantations in southern states. I wasn't thinking broadly enough. Slavery has a very wide footprint all throughout these nations. And I don't know where all the students are from that's plugged into this, but I bet if they Google slavery in their state, something's going to pop up. And some of you are going to be surprised. because you say you live in this northern state somewhere. There's no slavery here. Well, Google it. You're going to be surprised.
Yeah, and even and of course the North was so deeply implicated in the whole economic system that, as our colleague John Wells has been writing about this year, it's so implicated in just the whole system. Thank you so much, Joe. That idea of getting out of your comfort zone, I think, is one of the key messages that I've taken from your work, and I hope people who are in attendance today take away. Thank you so much. I don't know how we do like a round of applause, unmute or do your little things or whatever, but thank you.
All right, well, you are welcome. And Leslie, at your first opportunity, if you can throw the link in there for the upcoming conference as just a participant or a presenter. Throw that up there and see if we can get some folks to either attend the conference as a spectator to get in on some of this knowledge that we're going to be disseminating, or present something. They may know something about their family that they want to talk about. I'm going to do. I don't have the link off the top of my head because I'm a terrible board member in that way. But there are the dates, and if anybody wants information, just pop me an email and I will send you a link to the call for proposals, because we are taking proposals for the next roughly 3 weeks. Yes. And it'd be great to have Michigan represented. Thanks, Joe. You are so welcome. And welcome to Michigan. All right, all right. Yes, and I'm going to be there physically at some point. We'll get here. Thanks, everybody.
So you're getting lots of applause in the chat, so I just wanted to make sure you know that. But thank you so much for everyone for joining us today, and thank you so much, Joe.
All right, guys, I'm going to check out. Bye. See you soon. Bye.
Bye, everyone.